In Ukraine, a flurry of decisions and statements emerged from both rebel leaders and the Zelensky government as shelling intensified at the Eastern Front. Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, said that he sought dialogue with President Putin. He was met with silence. Zelensky also warned that over 200,000 soldiers and thousands of combat vehicles were at Ukraine's border.
Сегодня я инициировал телефонный разговор с президентом Российской Федерации. Результат – тишина. Ваши войска, почти 200 тысяч солдат, тысячи боевых машин. Ваше руководство одобрило их шаг вперед на территорию другой страны. И этот шаг может стать началом большой войны на европейском континенте. О том, что может произойти со дня на день, сегодня говорит весь мир. Причина может возникнуть в любой момент. Любая провокация.
Zelensky's remarks come as Ukraine approved a nationwide state of emergency in the country starting from today and will last 30 days. The state of emergency will allow the government to impose curfews and restrictions on movement, block rallies, ban political parties and organizations. Kiev has also mobilized its military reserve. More than 200,000 reservists have been put on notice. They will receive summons to return to their units. Ukraine has also reported an increase in cybersecurity attacks. The latest such attack was reported by a cybersecurity firm, which alleged a data wiping program was found in hundreds of computers. Earlier on Wednesday, the websites of Ukraine's government, foreign ministries, state security service were down in what the government said was another denial of service attack. Now, in another major development, separatists in Ukraine have asked Russia for help to what they call aggression from Kiev. The head of the Donetsk rebel government said that while Russian forces were not in the region at the moment, they could arrive in the future. Now, before we go on any further, let's just cut across to the United Nations Security Council meeting that has commenced on a vote for condemning Russia.
To warmly welcome the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, and give him the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, I want to reaffirm what I expressed this morning in the meeting of the General Assembly. But of course, it wouldn't make any sense to bother you reading again the same text that I'm sure you are all aware of. In between, during the day, a number of events took place, and with your permission, Mr. President, I would like to ask Ms. Rosemary Di Carlo to be able to brief you on those events. But simultaneously, the day was full of rumors and indications that an offensive against Ukraine was imminent. In the recent past, there were several situations with similar indications, similar rumors. And I never believed in them, convinced that nothing serious would happen. I was wrong. And I would like not to be wrong again today. So, if indeed an operation is being prepared, I have only one thing to say from the bottom of my heart. President Putin, stop your troops from attacking the Ukraine. Give peace a chance. Too many people have already died. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Secretary General for his introductory remarks. And I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary Di Carlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. Earlier today, the so-called authorities of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics requested military assistance from the Russian Federation. Also today, the Ukrainian authorities declared a nationwide state of emergency and announced other related defense and security measures, including the mobilization of reservists. Throughout the day, we've seen disturbing reports of continued heavy shelling across the contact line and civilian and military casualties. There are also reports of the repeated targeting of civilian infrastructure. This evening, different media are carrying reports of an ongoing large-scale military buildup and on military columns moving towards Ukraine. The Russian Federation has also reportedly shut airspace to civilian aircraft near the border with Ukraine. The United Nations cannot verify any of these reports, but if these developments were confirmed, they would greatly aggravate an already dangerous situation. The Ukrainian authorities are also reporting a new large-scale cyber attack targeting several state and financial institutions. Mr. President, President Zelensky earlier this evening called for continued diplomacy. Separately, President Putin also spoke about his continued readiness to engage in dialogue. We encourage such efforts, even at this late hour. UN staff remain on the ground to provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine. We are committed to staying and delivering. All parties must ensure their safety and security. Respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law is also paramount. We cannot predict exactly what will happen in the coming hours and days in Ukraine. What is clear is the unacceptably high cost in human suffering and destruction of an escalation. The people of Ukraine want peace, and I'm certain the people of Russia want peace. We must do everything in our power to ensure that peace prevails. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor first to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, this is the fourth time the Council is meeting in Ukraine in a matter of weeks. Every time we meet, reality on the ground confirms, bit by bit, what some of us have been anticipating. Russia has been saying one thing and doing its contrary. We were told troops were retreating when they only have increased. We were told to stop hysteria since troops were in Russian territory. No longer, they are invading a neighbor unprovoked with false pretexts, false narratives, and fabricated news. Every development unfolding in the last 48 hours confirms to us and to the world that Russian worries have nothing to do with its security, that its anxieties are not linked to NATO enlargement, that this issue is not a confrontation between Russia and the West. This is a confrontation between Russia and international law, the UN Charter that it deliberately has chosen to ignore, a confrontation between a hegemonistic vision and the rules-based world order. Dear colleagues, it's not about Russia's concern, it's about Russia's appetite. The Ukrainians are facing another aggression just because they dare to exist, because they have chosen to be independent, because they have opted for democracy. Dear colleagues, this is a dark hour not only for Ukraine, but for the entire international community as we witness with trepidation the progression of a pure act of aggression carefully planned and cold-bloodedly being executed. We called and hoped for a back down of the Russian Federation from this senseless, destructive and self-destructive action. We repeat the same call for Russia to stop, to reflect, to reverse its illegal decisions, to withdraw from this senseless madness, to de-escalate, not to push towards precipice. Several mechanisms are in place and various proposals have been made, including by President Zelensky, whose calls remain unanswered. Diplomacy is like hope. It dies last. But for it to work, it must be seized, not ignored, as the Secretary General just called for here. We call on the fellow members of the Security Council to rally in support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia has been warned repeatedly that they will be alone in this foolishness, that they will be responsible for the innocent lives lost, including Russians maybe, and for the destruction caused in the heart of Europe in the 21st century. If they choose to continue to execute their plans, as everything indicates, they will bear not only the consequences of the war, but also the historical blame and shame of invading a neighboring country when its responsibility as a big country, as a permanent member of the Security Council, calls for it to work and help preserve peace and security, not to torpedo it. We reiterate our support to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders and territorial waters. In concluding, I welcome the presence of the permanent representative of Ukraine to this meeting. I would like to convey to him, to the Ukrainian government and people, that at this most critical moment in their history, they are not alone, and we stand firm in full solidarity with them for their rights to be free and choose who they want to be. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Secretary General. Thank you for your strong stance and your powerful remarks today at the General Assembly and for your remarks tonight. Colleagues, a few moments ago, I spoke to President Biden, who asked me to convey in the strongest possible terms his and our steadfast support for Ukraine and support for the urgent meeting this Council has convened tonight. Furthermore, he asked me to share that the United States and our allies and partners will continue to respond to Russia's actions with unity, with clarity, and with conviction. We are here tonight because we believe, along with Ukraine, that a full-scale further invasion into Ukraine by Russia is imminent. Tonight, we're seeing the Russians close airspace, move troops into Donbass, and move forces into combat-ready positions. This is a perilous moment, and we're here for one reason and one reason only: to ask Russia to stop, return to your borders, send your troops and your tanks and your planes back to their barracks and hangars, and send your diplomats to the negotiating table. Back away from the brink before it is too late. Last week, the United States informed this Council and the world about what we expected to see unfold. We said that Russia would manufacture a pretext for an attack. We have since seen numerous false flag events staged along the lines of contact in Donbass. We said Russia would theatrically convene emergency meetings at the highest levels of the Russian government. We all saw this on Monday with the state televised Security Council meeting held by President Putin, an orchestrated moment in which the Russian government decided to recognize as, and I quote, independent states, unquote, sovereign territory of Ukraine controlled by Russia's proxies since 2014. They literally violated Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity on live television before the world. We said that false proclamations would come declaring Russia would need to defend Russian speakers in Ukraine. We got that and much more from President Putin's speech on Monday and during the speech of the Russian ambassador in the General Assembly today. No one could have predicted just how dangerous, inciting, and far-reaching President Putin's speech would be, with Putin arguing for taking the world back in time to an era of empires and colonies. Finally, we said the attack would come next, that we could expect communications to be jammed, cyber attacks to shut down key Ukrainian institutions. Last week, we attributed to Russia denial of service attacks against Ukrainian banks, and we saw similar activity this morning targeting government sites as well. And in the last few hours, we have received very concerning reports of destructive malware placed on hundreds of computers and executed on at least some. After that, we said would come the bombs and missiles, the soldiers and the tanks. Already soldiers have been deployed to the occupied region of Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here tonight because we believe the rest is imminent. Now, over the past few weeks, Russia has called our predictions hysterical. Russia said we were lying. Russia said we were supplying the world with misinformation. Russia's diplomats even laughed in the face of the human suffering we were sounding the alarm about. But what we said would happen has come to pass for all the world to see. So let us be clear. All parties are not culpable here. There's no middle ground. Calling for both sides to de-escalate only gives Russia a pass. Russia is the aggressor here. Russia's attack on Ukraine is tantamount to an attack on the UN and every member state in the chamber tonight. The Security Council is charged with adjudicating threats to peace and security. Russia is bypassing it entirely and taking matters into its own hands. And that undermines the institution. It undermines everyone who participates in it. The United States, Ukraine, its allies, and partners across Europe, UN officials, every other member of this Security Council, we have all repeatedly implored Russia to engage at the diplomatic table. Those calls were not heard. Instead, tonight, Russia has brought its people, the Ukrainian people, and the world to the brink of a conflict that will produce an untold amount of human suffering. I said it in the General Assembly this morning, and I'll say it again tonight. Everyday Russians should be asking themselves right now how many Russian lives Putin will sacrifice for his cynical ambitions. Responsible members of this Security Council will stand together, and we will stand with Ukraine. And we will do so despite a reckless, irresponsible, permanent member of the Security Council abusing its powers to attack its neighbor and subvert the UN and our international system. This morning in the General Assembly, we saw dozens of leaders from across the globe stand up to defend the UN Charter and Ukraine against Russia's brazen attacks. We were proud to stand with them. Today, I had the opportunity to meet with Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba. And many of you were in the General Assembly Hall this morning when Foreign Minister Kuleba received enthusiastic and overwhelming applause after his remarks. Since he could not be here this evening, I would like to conclude by echoing his words. This morning, he warned us all that, quote, no one will be able to sit out this crisis if President Putin decides that he can move forward with this aggression against Ukraine. Your governments and your people will face painful consequences together with our government and our people, unquote. He is right. History tells us that, and we must confront this threat head on in this council, in the UN, and in our capitals. The people of Ukraine are counting on us. Let's not let them down. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Mr. President, I thank the Secretary-General and Under-Secretary-General DiCarlo for their remarks. We are here tonight to call on Russia to avert war. For months, Russia has been holding a gun to Ukraine's head. Now, President Putin's finger is on the trigger. A full-scale conflict in a country of 44 million people will bring immense suffering, casualties on both sides, and devastating humanitarian consequences. The members of this Council, the General Assembly, and the Secretary-General have all called this week for respect for the principles of the UN Charter. The world is calling for peace, but Russia is not listening. Mr. President, make no mistake, the UK will not compromise. We will not compromise our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, our support for peace, prosperity, and the democratic freedom of the people of Ukraine. We will not compromise our commitment to the purpose and principles of the UN Charter. Above all, the founding principle of this United Nations, that we live together in peace with one another as good neighbours. Russia's actions are an assault on the Charter. And we will not compromise our commitment to a search for peace. We're here for the second time this week in the Council. My Prime Minister and Foreign and Defence Secretaries have been unsparing in their diplomatic efforts. But we have also announced a significant further sanction step against Russia with our allies, a package targeted against some of the Russian oligarchs, banks, and politicians supporting President Putin. And we will ratchet up economic consequences should Russia continue its aggression. There is still time for restraint, reason, and de-escalation. But that time is now. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I thank the Secretary-General for his engagement and for his call, which France fully supports. As we speak, Russia is on the verge of provoking chaos in Ukraine and striking an unjustifiable blow to peace and security in the heart of Europe. For several months, the President of the Russian Federation has patiently prepared the means for a major offensive against Ukraine. He has massed soldiers and gathered weapons at an unprecedented level since the end of the Second World War. He has incited violence through lies and disinformation. He has denied even the legitimacy of the Ukrainian state. He has attacked sovereignty and the integrity of Ukraine
by recognizing the independence of portions of Ukrainian territory. Faced with a strategy of threats and destabilization, Ukraine has demonstrated admirable restraint. It did not resort to violence despite Russian provocation. I wish to reiterate our solidarity with the people of Ukraine, as President Macron reminded his Ukrainian counterpart a few hours ago. Faced with this strategy of disorder and confrontation, the leaders of Europe and the United States showed their unity and redoubled their efforts to propose a diplomatic outcome. President Macron, together with Chancellor Scholz and many partners, have all done their part. They have demonstrated their availability to build with Russia a renewed security architecture for Europe. France strongly condemns the strategy of provocation to war of the Russian president. We hear the call of the Ukrainian people, conveyed by President Zelensky in his address to the Russian nation a few hours ago. Ukrainians want peace. They want a relationship of good neighborliness with Russia, mirroring the family and personal relationships which bind to so many Russians and Ukrainians. The international community, Mr. President, has made its voice heard, its united voice, today at the General Assembly. It is that of respect of the Charter of the United Nations, the peaceful settlement of disputes, that of diplomacy. It echoes the clear declarations of the Secretary-General. Once again, we call on the Russian Federation to follow this path, to draw back on its decision to recognize separatist entities of eastern Ukraine and to call its soldiers back. We call each of the members of this council to act responsibly and to resolutely support all initiatives to prevent and put an end to violations of the Charter of the United Nations. If Russia confirms that its choice is war, it will have to take all of the responsibility and pay the price. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'd like to thank the Secretary-General and Under-Secretary-General De Carlo for their very sobering remarks at the beginning of our meeting. Mr. President, tonight as we gather at this table, we are staring into the abyss of a major conflict in Europe, a conflict that would have major global implications. Tonight, the core principles of this United Nations, in which we believe, are under attack. In Ireland, we know the importance of the rules-based international order. We know the importance of respecting the voice and integrity of all countries, big or small. Most fundamentally, we know the value of peace. We believe that one state threatening and using lethal force against another to get its way or to expand its territory is no solution. Ireland has a deep understanding, informed by our history, that dialogue and respect resolve disputes. Tonight, this drives our solidarity with Ukraine. It is our collective responsibility, indeed our obligation here at this table, to maintain international peace and security, nothing less. That means we stand up for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of every member state of the United Nations. Let's be clear, the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine have not changed. The decision by Russia to recognize as independent entities the non-government controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine does not change those borders one iota. They did not change in 2014, and they have not changed this week. We urge the Russian Federation to reverse this decision immediately. We urge the Russian Federation to refrain from further escalatory unilateral actions which can only serve to further deepen this crisis. Tonight, the path for diplomacy, the path for dialogue that we have called on for so long is perilously narrow. The principles of the UN Charter we hold dear have already been breached. These principles now risk being further violated. This is the time to show courage, the courage and the time now to pull back from the precipice, the time to return to dialogue and to diplomacy. The use of military aggression has no place in our modern world. Have we learned absolutely nothing from our history? These United Nations rose from the ashes of 2 world wars. The senseless destruction of that era was born of a belief that military might makes right. This philosophy, applied with modern weaponry, would unleash devastation and human suffering, affecting millions of innocent people. Tonight, we stand with the people of Ukraine. Tonight, we stand with the UN Charter. We stand with those who, even in this dark hour, still have the courage and hope to bring us back from this precipice. A resort to military conquest for one state to impose its will unilaterally against another, to annex part of its territory, has absolutely no place in the 21st century. There is still a choice to turn from the path of war to the path of diplomacy and dialogue. Mr. President, it is never too late to make the right choice. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking Secretary General for his briefing on the evolving situation in the eastern regions of Ukraine. The Security Council had met 2 days ago and discussed the situation. We had called for urgent de-escalation of tensions and emphasized on sustained and focused diplomacy to address all issues concerning the situation. However, we note with regret that the calls of the international community to give time to the recent initiatives undertaken by parties to diffuse tensions were not heeded too. The situation is in danger of spiraling into a major crisis. We express our deep concern over the developments which, if not handled carefully, may well undermine the peace and security of the region. We call for immediate de-escalation and for refraining from any further action that could contribute to a worsening of the situation. We call on all parties to exert greater efforts to bridge divergent interests. I would like to underline that the legitimate security interests of all parties should be fully taken into account. India has consistently advocated at the United Nations the need for peaceful settlement of disputes in accordance with international law and with agreements entered into by parties concerned. I underline once again that more than 20,000 Indian nationals, including students, are located in different parts of Ukraine, including in its border areas. We are facilitating the return of all Indian nationals, including students, as may be required. We believe that the solution lies in sustained diplomatic dialogue between the concerned parties. In the meantime, we strongly emphasize the vital need for all sides to maintain international peace and security by exercising the utmost restraint. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
سيد الرئيس، أود بداية أن أشكر الأمين العام ووكيلة الأمين العام على مداخلاتهما. اجتماعنا هذا هو الاجتماع الرابع الذي يعقده مجلس.
Mr. President, this is the fourth meeting held by the Council on Ukraine in this month. In light of the recent developments, in light of the recent and alarming tensions, my country has taken a firm position calling for de-escalation and efforts to find a peaceful solution to the crisis between the concerned parties. In this context, we would like to point out the following. First, we affirm the importance of engaging in dialogue in good faith while intensifying diplomatic efforts at all levels to support the opportunities of peace on the basis of international law. We reiterate the Minsk agreements still constitute a good basis for reaching a peaceful solution to the crisis and maintaining regional and international security and stability. Second, we stress the importance of adherence to the principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations, particularly in settling international disputes through peaceful means and respecting the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity of states. Adherence to these principles and compliance with the Charter of the United Nations constitute a central pillar in finding a sustainable and peaceful solution to the current crisis. Third, we reiterate that the crisis in eastern Ukraine could exacerbate the critical conditions of the civilians. Furthermore, there are obstacles to the delivery of humanitarian assistance to some of those in need, even before the recent tensions arise, particularly in the areas near the contact line in eastern Ukraine. Any further escalation could worsen the humanitarian situation for a larger number of civilians. We therefore emphasize the importance of de-escalation and ceasefire. In this regard, we urge all parties not to obstruct the access to humanitarian aid or the movement of civilians in conflict areas, in accordance with their obligations under international law. Finally, Mr. President, the UAE reiterates the importance of de-escalation, constructive dialogue, and to continue efforts to reach peaceful solutions consistent with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
President, I thank the Secretary General and USG Rosemary DiCarlo for their important statement. We are facing the dire prospect of a major war in Europe. Norway strongly condemns the decision by President Putin to send Russian troops into Donetsk and Luhansk regions and the latest announcements of special military operation. These decisions are unjustified, unprovoked, and irresponsible. We call on Russia to reverse these decisions and to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all its military forces from the territory of Ukraine and in the vicinity of its internationally recognized borders. Our thoughts are with those who have already suffered too much due to this conflict, and with all those who are afraid that tomorrow will be a lot worse. We call upon all parties to strictly respect the relevant provisions of international humanitarian law, which calls on the protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel and civilian infrastructure, and to facilitate safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access to those in need in Ukraine. Like the Secretary General clearly stated, the decision of the Russian Federation to recognize the so-called independent of Donetsk and Luhansk regions are violation of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine and are inconsistent with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Let me recall the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, which are now under threat. The Charter applies to all nations, including Russia. Today in the General Assembly, member states from all over the world strongly urge the parties to pursue negotiation towards a peaceful resolution of the conflict, with respect for international law and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Norway urges Russia, as a party to the Minsk Agreement and to the conflict, to fulfill its commitments, to abide by international law and to return to the path of diplomacy. Russia has taken on a clear commitment to seek a peaceful settlement to this conflict and must honor it. We commend Ukraine's posture of restraint in the face of continued provocation and destabilization efforts. President, let me conclude by again reiterating Norway's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its international recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the situation in Ukraine is at a critical juncture. China has been paying close attention to the situation. In the current context, all parties concerned should exercise restraint and avoid the further escalation of tensions. We believe that the door to a peaceful solution to the Ukraine issue is not fully shut, nor should it be. China has pointed out on many occasions that there is a complex historical context on the Ukraine issue, and that the current situation is the result of the interplay of many factors. China's position on safeguarding the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states has been consistent. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be jointly upheld. We hope that all parties concerned will stay cool-headed and rational and commit themselves to enhance dialogue and consultation to resolve relevant issues properly through negotiations and address each other's legitimate security concerns in line with the principles of the UN Charter. It is especially important at the moment to avoid fueling tensions. China will continue to promote peace talks in its own ways and welcomes and encourages all efforts aimed at a diplomatic solution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank the Secretary General and the Under-Secretary General, Rosemary DiCarlo, for the information and remarks they have put before the Council tonight. Mr. President, the reports received about the movement of troops into certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk in Ukraine are cause for extreme concern. The threat or use of force against the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of a UN member state is unacceptable. In the present circumstances, the Security Council must act according to its main purpose as holder of the primary responsibility under the United Nations Charter for the maintenance of international peace and security. In the exercise of this responsibility, its actions must be geared towards reduction in tensions, towards assisting parties in their negotiations. This is our primary role. The recourse to arms and confrontation cannot lead to lasting peace. In that regard, we call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and refrain from any action that may further increase tensions on the ground. The time is not for belligerent rhetoric, nor for military threats, but to engage truly in a diplomatic process. The means of negotiation have not been exhausted. Immediate de-escalation is of high order. It means, among others, complete and unconditional withdrawal of all military forces as an effective measure for the prevention and removal of threats to peace. parties must abide by the terms of the Minsk agreements, above all by its call for a comprehensive ceasefire. The monitoring mission of the OSCE can assist if granted unrestrained access in order to verify, identify, and report accordingly any violation of the ceasefire. Furthermore, the parties must allow the rapid, safe, and unhindered access of humanitarian assistance to those in need. The protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel and persons in vulnerable situations, must be respected unconditionally. We redouble our calls for the parties to work constructively in all relevant instances, such as the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group. Negotiations must be mindful of the principles of the UN Charter, including sovereignty, independence, unity, and territory.
На постсоветском пространстве стран. Мы уважаем и будем уважать их суверенитет. И пример тому – помощь, которую мы оказали Казахстану, который столкнулся с трагическими событиями.
Must be respected unconditionally. We redouble our calls for the parties to work constructively in all relevant instances, such as the Normandy format and the Trilateral Contact Group. Negotiations must be mindful of the principles of the UN Charter, including sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of its member states. Negotiations must also, on one hand, take into account the security concerns of all parts of the conflict and, on the other hand, aim to create the adequate conditions for an inclusive political dialogue which must reflect the diversity of and include representation from all peoples of the region. Brazil does not underestimate the complexity of the current situation, but we insist on dialogue as key to achieve a lasting settlement to this conflict. Too much is at stake here, above all the lives of many civilians. We owe them all our efforts to bring this crisis to a peaceful solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю представителя Бразилии за его заявление и предоставляю слово представителю Ганы.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And let me begin by, first of all, thanking the Secretary General and USG, Rosemary DiCarlo, for their significant briefings. Mr. Secretary General, Ghana is grateful to you for your clear statements on the situation in Ukraine, in defense of the Charter, the rules-based international order, and our collective security mechanism. The developments that are taking place in Ukraine are indeed troubling. The situation has implications not only for Ukraine and its immediate neighbors, but also for all our countries. Security is indivisible, and the insecurity of one is the insecurity of all. As we indicated in our statement to the Council on Monday night, Ghana deeply regrets the decision of the Russian Federation to unilaterally recognize the non-government controlled regions of Ukraine and to send troops into those regions. We are also deeply concerned by the implications of those decisions, which suggest that the Russian Federation has turned its back on the Minsk agreements and the path of dialogue required to address any concerns it may have over the implementation of the agreements and related security concerns. We have, however, read in reports this morning the statement attributed to the President of the Russian Federation that his country was always open to diplomacy. We urge that that avowed commitment to diplomacy that the Russian Federation has alluded to should be backed by present actions that de-escalate the situation on the ground and permit an atmosphere for dialogue. We note with concern the risk that an escalation of the situation in Ukraine holds for global peace and security, and stress that those that choose the path of conflict rather than peace bear the consequences of their actions. We are concerned by reports of the commencement of hybrid warfare against Ukraine, especially attempts of cyber attacks against some of its critical infrastructure. To de-escalate the situation, we urge the Russian Federation to reconsider any intentions to move troops into the eastern regions of Ukraine in response to the purported request by the leaders of the separatist regions for an intervention. Peacekeeping by its nature requires the consent of the parties and the impartiality of the peacekeeping force. The presence of the Russian troops in eastern Ukraine at this time would not fulfill those requirements. If there is a real need, the Council should be seized of the matter. We urge for calm and call upon all parties to maintain the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. We are particularly concerned by the high intensity of violations of the ceasefire in recent days and its consequences on the civilian populations in the Donbas region. We remind all parties of the need to respect international law and international humanitarian law and urge the parties to guarantee unimpeded access for humanitarian assistance in both government and non-government controlled areas. We condemn any military activity that would deliberately target civilians and civilian infrastructure and remind all parties of the personal responsibility that exists in international law. Mr. President, it may be begging the question, but nonetheless worth repeating. Ghana unreservedly stands by the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, a bona fide member of the United Nations, whose membership of this organization provides for her guarantees over her internationally recognized borders, the same borders with which she joined this organization. We aver that the current developments in the eastern regions of Ukraine would not lead to a strategic gain for any party and encourage efforts to address both immediate and long-term interests through diplomacy and dialogue. As called for by the preamble of the Charter, we remind all parties to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. Finally, we take this opportunity to urge all member states to exercise restraints on the respective unsettled but accepted situations across the globe and to uphold the collective security mechanism established through the Charter of the United Nations. Any differences that exist
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.